Now let's discuss two more options white has in this position. Knight f3 and also bishop c4. I will start with knight f3. After knight f3, white is arguing that he might play an open Sicilian with d4, and black might not be an hyper-accelerated dragon player, so it makes some sense. But this should not worry us, because white is down a tempo in this variation. We play bishop to g7, and now white can either play d4, which leads to a kind of open Sicilian, or play c3 and lead the game into an Alapin. But if we play c3 right now, we can simply play d5. And after e takes d5, queen takes d5, d4, knight c6, we transpose into a line we have discussed after third move c3. Therefore, if white wants to play c3 and then d4, he has to start with bishop c4 and stop black from playing d5. Bishop c4, and now as a rule of thumb, whenever white plays bishop c4, we should go for e6 d5. In the current position, if we start with e6, white might play d4. So I suggest we play knight c6 first, cover d4. Now white plays c3 to play d4. We play e6, and we want to play d5. White is in no position to stop that. He can play d4 as he has prepared with c3, and after c takes d4, we play d5. If the bishop now retreats to d3, we take on e4, and white will have to play with an isolated queen's pawn. And if he takes on d5, we recapture on d5, we force the bishop to move, and we can continue with moves like knight to e7, castle short, bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3, and we can attack the pawn on d4. For example, knight f5, and the pawn gets under fire by the minor pieces of black. So bishop c4 with the idea of playing c3 followed by d4 is not a problem. And after bishop g7, white instead should probably opt for an open Sicilian now and play d4. We follow our rule of thumb. Whenever white plays d4 and has not played c3 before that, we need to take on d4 to avoid d5 and the transposition to Benoni. C takes d4, knight takes d4, and now we play knight c6, hitting d4. If white takes on c6, we can recapture on c6 and play d5 later on. So white should not play like that and instead play bishop to e3, protect the knight on d4. We go knight f6, we are threatening the pawn on e4. And if white now takes on c6, we can recapture on c6, and on e5 we can play queen a5 check, and we are winning the pawn on e5. So knight takes c6 followed by e5 does not make sense, and instead after knight f6 white should play knight c3, protecting the pawn on e4. Now we castle short, and our idea on the next move is to play d5. For example, if white continues with a move like f3 and he's intending to play queen to d2, castle long, and then h4, h5 with bishop h6 and attack on the king side, he will not get this position because we can play immediately d5 and the game immediately opens up. This means that white has to stop black from executing the pawn push to d5. So instead, white might play bishop c4, which stops d5, but allows a tactical trick. We can take on e4, and after knight takes e4, we play d5. And again, we are opening up the position and winning back our minor piece. This means that bishop c4 also does not work well for white. And instead, after castling short, the best move for white is to play knight to b3. The idea of knight b3 is to stop d5. In this position, black has two setups. He can either play for d6 followed by bishop e6 and then d5, or he can go for b6, bishop b7, rook c8. Let's look at both of them. If you play d6, white will most likely just develop with moves like bishop e2. We can go bishop e6, and then our idea is to play d5. White might play f4, so we can answer d5 with e5. And here we can either play queen to d7 or queen c8, both times with the idea of either going bishop to g4 or knight to g4 to exchange some minor pieces, because black has some space disadvantage. The other option after knight b3 is to play b6. After bishop e2, bishop b7, castle short, rook c8, black is ready to play knight e5 and knight c4. For example, queen to d2, we play knight e5, threatening to take on e4, or playing knight c4, or even playing the pawn push d5. In all those lines, the extra tempo should ensure black an easy game. So let's go back to second move g6 and look at the third move bishop c4. White could try to play a setup where the d-pawn is not placed on d4 but on d3 instead, combined with the moves knight c3, knight e2, castle short, and then f4, and later maybe even f5. We should continue with bishop g7, knight c3, knight c6, d3, and again, because the bishop is on c4, we go for the e6 d5 plan. That's why we play e6, knight g e2, knight g e7. We are ready to play d5, and white is intending to castle short and play f4, queen e1, queen h4. So castle, f4. White is either intending to play queen e1, queen h4, and then f5 with an attack, or he can draw back with a bishop to a2. So he can always answer d5 with e5. But in the current position, we can play d5. White has two options. He can allow black to capture on e4, or he can capture on d5 himself. If he captures on d5, we recapture with a pawn, the bishop has to retreat, and we bring out our last piece with bishop to e6. This position is clearly better for black. We can play knight f5 later on, maybe take control over square d4. The bishop is very active on the long diagonal, and white will not find easy squares for the bishop on c1, and the bishop a2 is out of the game. Also, the pawn is misplaced on f4 and is blocking in the bishop from c1. This means that taking on d5 is not a good idea for white, and instead, after d5, white should probably play bishop to a2. After bishop a2, white might play e5 on his next move and block in our bishop on g7. So in order to avoid white closing the game, I suggest we take on e4 now. After d takes e4, white has two options. He can take on e4 with his knight or with a pawn. If he takes on e4 with a knight, we play b6. We might continue with bishop to b7, queen to d7, and rook d8, going maybe knight d4 or knight f5. The c5 pawn ensures black a better control over the center, while the pawn on f4 is misplaced for white and blocks in the bishop on c1. This means that after d takes e4, white should most likely take on e4 with his pawn instead. And here I suggest we play b6. The idea is to play bishop a6 and maybe later on knight d4. With the open center, white has no time to play for queen e1 and queen h4 with attacking ideas. And in this position, black should also have the easier game. This concludes our analysis on the third move knight f3 and also third move bishop c4.